There is a city that once dreamed louder than any other on earth, a city of libraries and lighthouses, of philosophers and merchants, of gods borrowed from every corner of the known world, and arranged side by side along colonnaded streets that stretched toward a harbor blue as polished lapis. Lazily, Alexandria, founded by a Macedonian conqueror who never lived to see it bloom, it became, in the centuries after his death, the most dazzling metropolis of the ancient world, a place where Greek intellect and Egyptian mystery fused into something that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. It was into this city, in the year 69 BC, that a girl was born who would one day become its last and most luminous queen. We do not know the precise day of her birth. We do not know the name of her mother, who vanishes from the ancient record like a figure stepping behind a curtain and never emerging again. What we know is that she was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal house that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since the death of Alexander the Great, and that she entered a world already trembling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks by origin, which means that for 250 years, Egypt had been governed by a foreign dynasty that dressed in the robes of pharaohs while conducting its court in Greek. Most of them never learned the Egyptian language. They presided over festivals they did not understand, worshipped gods they had adopted out of political necessity, and intermarried with such relentless consistency that the genetic consequences of their family tree were, by the time our story begins, beginning to show. The girl born in 69 BC would break this pattern in a way that no Ptolemy before her ever had. But that story belongs to a later chapter. Her father was Ptolemy XII, a man whose nickname Alitz, meaning the flute player, tells you almost everything you need to know about how his contemporaries regarded him. He was not a warrior king. He was not a philosopher king. He was a man who loved music and wine and the warmth of his own court. A man who struggled desperately to maintain his grip on a throne that was always, it seemed, on the verge of being pulled out from under him. Egypt, by the time of his reign, was no longer the supreme power it had once been. Rome loomed over the Mediterranean world like a colossus, swallowing kingdoms whole, and every ruler from the Aegean to the Euphrates understood that the question was not whether Rome would come for them, but when, and on what terms. Ptolemy XII spent enormous sums of money bribing Roman senators to recognize his legitimacy as king. He borrowed heavily from Roman bankers to do it. The debt he accumulated was staggering, and the taxes he imposed to service that debt made him deeply unpopular with his own people. In 58 BC, when Cleopatra was approximately 11 years old, the Alexandrians rose against him and drove him into exile. He fled to Rome, leaving his daughter Bernice IV to rule in his absence. And there, in the corridors of Roman power, he continued his lobbying, his bribing, his desperate performance of usefulness to the men who controlled the world. He would eventually return in 55 BC, with Roman soldiers at his back, soldiers provided by the Roman general Aulus Gabinius, whose services Ptolemy had purchased at ruinous cost. He reclaimed his throne and had Bernice executed. His daughter watched all of this. She was 14 years old, and she was learning what Cleopatra learned during those years of her father's instability and exile was not what most royal daughters were expected to learn. Or rather, she learned those things too, and far more besides. The ancient sources, writing centuries after her death, describe her as a woman of extraordinary intellectual attainment. And while we must always approach ancient praise with a degree of skepticism, particularly praise directed at women, the consistency of these accounts across multiple sources suggests that something real underlies the reputation. Plutarch, writing in the early 2nd century AD, describes her command of languages as particularly remarkable. She spoke, he tells us, at least 9 languages, including Egyptian, which no Ptolemaic ruler before her had troubled to learn. Ethiopic, the language of the troglodytes, which likely refers to various peoples of the Red Sea coast, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, the Parthian language, and Latin. She spoke Greek, of course, as her mother tongue. This linguistic range was not mere accomplishment for its own sake. It was a political tool of the highest order. When Cleopatra received ambassadors, she spoke to them in their own language without an interpreter, a gesture that carried enormous symbolic weight in a world where language was power and translation was vulnerability. She was educated at the Mausoleum, the great institution of learning that was the heart of Alexandrian intellectual life. The famous Library of Alexandria was associated with this institution, and while the library had suffered damage in earlier centuries and was never quite the monolithic repository of all human knowledge that later legend made it, it remained in Cleopatra's time one of the greatest collections of texts in the world. She grew up in an environment where the most advanced thinking in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature was taking place, and the evidence suggests she was an active participant in that intellectual world, rather than a passive beneficiary of it. Later traditions, including texts from the early Byzantine period, attribute to her authored works on subjects including alchemy, gynecology, and weights and measures. Most scholars treat these attributions with caution. It was common practice in the ancient world to attach royal names to texts as a form of prestige, but the very existence of these attributions speaks to the image she projected even in her own lifetime. A ruler who was not merely beautiful or seductive, as later Roman propaganda would insist, but formidably, dangerously intelligent. She was also learning governance. As her father aged and the political situation in Egypt remained precarious, Cleopatra was increasingly involved in the administration of the kingdom. By the time she was 17 or 18, she was in effect his co-ruler, observing, participating, absorbing the mechanics of power in a state that was simultaneously one of the wealthiest in the world and one of the most politically fragile. Ptolemy XII died in the spring of 51 BC, leaving behind a kingdom that was, by any measure, in dire condition. The royal treasury was depleted by decades of debt payments to Rome. The agricultural economy, dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile, had suffered from a series of poor inundations that had reduced harvests and increased hunger among the peasant population. The Alexandrian court was a nest of factions and rivalries, and the succession itself was immediately complicated. Ptolemy had left the throne jointly to Cleopatra, who was now 18 years old, and to her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was approximately 10. This joint arrangement was a Ptolemaic tradition, partly practical. Two rulers could divide administrative responsibilities, and partly protective, since a sole female ruler was more vulnerable to challenge. But it was also an arrangement that contained within it the seeds of bitter conflict, since the younger siblings' guardians and advisors would inevitably seek to use their charge to advance their own interests, and the older siblings' authority would always be contested. Cleopatra moved quickly to establish herself. Unlike her predecessors, she embraced Egyptian culture and religion with what appears to have been genuine enthusiasm rather than mere political calculation, though political calculation was certainly present as well. She presented herself as the earthly embodiment of the goddess Isis, the most beloved deity in the Egyptian pantheon, goddess associated with magic, motherhood, healing, and the resurrection of the dead, and she cultivated this identification in temples, inscriptions, and public ceremonies throughout the country. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to appear on official documents and coins in Egyptian priestly dress rather than Hellenistic royal attire. She traveled up the Nile to Hermonthis to participate in the sacred installation of a new Buches bowl, a ceremony of enormous religious significance to the Egyptian people. She was making a statement, and the statement was this: I am not merely a Greek queen ruling over Egypt, I am Egypt. But the political situation was deteriorating. By 49 BC, Cleopatra's younger brother, guided by a triumvirate of advisors, the eunuch Pothinus, the military commander Achillas, and the rhetorician Theodotus, had effectively pushed her aside. Her name was removed from official documents. Coins were minted bearing only his image. She was, for all practical purposes, removed from power without ever formally being deposed, which was a more elegant and more dangerous maneuver than outright deposal, because it left her alive and potentially capable of recovering her position. Cleopatra responded by doing what her father had done before her. She went to gather support. She moved eastward toward the border of Egypt and Syria, where she began assembling an army. By early 48 BC, the two factions were facing each other across the desert near Pelusium, the fortified city that guarded Egypt's eastern gateway. A civil war was about to begin, and then the world changed everything. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in the autumn of 48 BC not as a conqueror, but as a pursuer. He had just won the decisive battle of Pharsalus in Greece, where he had destroyed the army of his rival Pompey the Great, and Pompey had fled eastward, seeking refuge wherever he might find it. He came to Egypt because Egypt was wealthy and because the young Ptolemy XIII owed his father political debts to the Roman power that Pompey had once represented. It seemed a reasonable place to seek sanctuary. It proved fatal. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, calculating that Caesar had won and that sheltering Caesar's enemy would bring Roman vengeance upon them, made the decision to murder Pompey as he stepped off his boat onto Egyptian soil. They presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift when he arrived at Alexandria shortly afterward. Caesar was said to have wept. Whether the tears were genuine grief or political theater is impossible to know. Caesar was a man who understood theater as well as he understood warfare, but the gesture itself is revealing. Pompey had been his enemy, but he had also been his son-in-law, the father of his grandchildren, a man with whom he had once shared the rule of the world. Whatever Caesar felt, he did not leave Egypt. He established himself in the royal palace and began what amounted to an occupation of the Alexandrian court. It was in this context that Cleopatra made her move. Surrounded by enemies, cut off from the capital, unable to approach Caesar openly because her brother's forces controlled the approaches to the palace, she arranged to be smuggled inside. Wrapped, according to the most famous version of the story told by Plutarch, in a linen sack, a merchant named Apollodorus brought this cargo to the palace, and inside it was the deposed queen of Egypt. The detail of the sack or the rolled carpet, versions of the story vary, has been treated by later ages as romantic legend, a theatrical entrance suited to a woman who would become one of history's most romantic figures. But beneath the theater lies a genuine political calculation of extraordinary boldness. Cleopatra needed to speak to Caesar before anyone could prevent the meeting. She needed to make an impression that could not be undone by Ptolemy's advisors, who would immediately seek to paint her as a rebel and a threat. She needed, in short, to take the biggest gamble of her life, to present herself to the most powerful man in the world and convince him, in a single meeting, that she was worth more to him as an ally than her brother was. She succeeded. We cannot know exactly what was said in that first meeting, what arguments she made, what portrait of herself she presented. What we know is that Caesar did not hand her back to her enemies. He invited both siblings to a formal meeting the following day, presenting himself as an arbiter of their dispute, and, when fighting broke out between Caesar's soldiers and the Alexandrians, he kept both royal siblings with him in the palace. The Alexandrian War, a conflict that lasted from the autumn of 48 BC into the spring of 47, was a strange and dangerous episode in Caesar's career. He was a general of genius, but he was in Alexandria with only a fraction of his usual forces, surrounded by a hostile city. fighting in unfamiliar urban terrain against an opponent who knew every alley and rooftop. The Alexandrians fought him with extraordinary ferocity, and there were moments when the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. It was during this period that Caesar ordered the burning of ships in the harbor, and whether by accident or design, fire spread to some buildings on the waterfront. Ancient sources disagree about exactly what burned, but the event gave rise to the enduring legend that Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. Modern scholarship is skeptical of this claim. The library, to the extent that it existed as a single institution, was located well away from the harbor, and the bulk of Alexandria's intellectual treasures appear to have survived well into late antiquity. What burned was almost certainly warehouses containing books destined for export, a genuine loss, but not the catastrophic destruction of all human knowledge that legend later invented. During these months of siege and street fighting and naval skirmishing, Cleopatra remained with Caesar. The relationship between them deepened from political alliance into something more personal. Though here again we must be cautious about the nature of our sources, most of which were written by Romans who had strong political reasons for presenting the story in particular ways. What seems clear is that by the time the war ended and Caesar's reinforcements arrived to relieve the siege, Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. The war ended in the Nile while attempting to flee, with the defeat and death of Ptolemy XIII, who drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee. Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne, pairing her this time with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, a child of 11, whose political insignificance was presumably part of his appeal as a co-ruler. The arrangement was transparent. Cleopatra was in charge, and Caesar had made it so. Before he left Egypt, Caesar spent several weeks with Cleopatra on a voyage up the Nile aboard the royal barge, a journey through the heart of the kingdom, past temples and monuments, and the villages of ordinary Egyptians, a display of power and legitimacy that served both of them in different ways. For Caesar, it was tourism and a demonstration of Roman influence. For Cleopatra, it was a statement to every subject she passed. Look at the Roman who stands beside me. Understand what this means about who I am. In June of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Philometor Caesar, but in Egypt and to history, he would be known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. The question of his paternity was, in the ancient world as it is today, a matter of considerable political sensitivity. Caesar himself never publicly acknowledged the child as his son, which was both legally cautious. Roman law did not recognize children born to foreign women as legitimate heirs, and politically prudent. Caesar had no legitimate sons by his Roman wife, and to acknowledge a foreign child would have opened a labyrinth of succession complications he had no desire to enter. But privately, Caesar does not seem to have denied the connection. Cleopatra gave the boy his name quite openly, and the claim was widely understood in the ancient world. When Cleopatra came to Rome in 46 BC, Caesar invited her, and she came with her son and her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, and a large retinue. The Roman public was fascinated and scandalized in approximately equal measure. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, and Caesar erected a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestress from whom the Julian family claimed descent, a gesture of breathtaking audacity that suggested he was thinking about Cleopatra in ways that went beyond the merely diplomatic. The Roman aristocracy was appalled. The rumors that circulated in Rome, that Caesar intended to move the capital to Alexandria, that he planned to make himself king and Cleopatra his queen, that he was contemplating legal changes that would allow him to take multiple wives, were probably exaggerated, but they were not entirely invented. Caesar was doing things that had no Roman precedent, and people drew their own conclusions. Cleopatra was still in Rome when the Ides of March arrived, when, on the 15th of March in the year 44 BC, A group of senators who called themselves the Liberators surrounded Julius Caesar in the theater of Pompey and stabbed him 23 times. She was, in all likelihood, at Caesar's villa across the river when it happened. She waited, perhaps to see whether the assassination would be followed by some political resolution that would preserve her position and her son's prospects. When it became clear that the situation in Rome was dissolving into chaos, she left, sailing back to Alexandria with Caesarion and whatever hopes she still harbored about the future. The years between Caesar's death in 44 BC and Cleopatra's meeting with Mark Antony in 41 BC were years of consolidation and survival. She returned to Egypt, reasserted her authority, and within months of her return, arranged the death of her brother Ptolemy XIV, who was replaced as her co-ruler by the infant Caesarion. She was done with troublesome siblings. She had watched her father lose his throne to one of them. She had narrowly survived the machinations of Ptolemy XIII. She was not going to provide future conspirators with a convenient Ptolemaic alternative. Egypt prospered during these years, at least by the standards of the ancient world. The Nile floods were cooperative, harvests were good, and Cleopatra proved herself an able administrator, maintaining the trade routes that made Egypt wealthy, managing the grain surplus that was the foundation of Egyptian power, and presenting herself throughout the country as a legitimate pharaoh in the full Egyptian tradition. She was the goddess Isis walking the earth, and she cultivated this identity not only in Alexandria, but in the temples of the Nile Valley, where priests carved her image in divine costume alongside the traditional deities of Egypt. Meanwhile, the Roman world was tearing itself apart. Caesar's assassins were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC by the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. The victors divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east. And the east meant, inevitably, that Mark Antony would eventually need to deal with Egypt, with its wealth, its grain, and its formidable queen. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in Asia Minor. The summons was that of a Roman general dealing with a client. Monarch of uncertain loyalties, Cleopatra had maintained careful neutrality during the Roman Civil War, and Antony wanted to assess exactly where her allegiances lay. What he got was something rather different from what he had expected. Plutarch's description of Cleopatra's arrival at Tarsus is one of the most celebrated passages in ancient biography, a set piece of almost cinematic grandeur that Shakespeare would later lift nearly verbatim into Antony and Cleopatra. She came, Plutarch tells us, sailing up the river Cydnus on a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails, while silver oars beat the water to the sound of flutes and pipes. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, the Greek goddess who was equated with the Egyptian Isis, attended by boys dressed as cupids who fanned her with their wings, and by women dressed as sea nymphs. Perfumes were burned so that their scent drifted to the shores, where crowds had gathered to watch. Antony was waiting for her in the marketplace, seated on a tribunal. By the time she arrived, the marketplace was empty. Everyone had gone to the river, and Antony, alone on his tribunal, received a message that the goddess Aphrodite had come to Asia for the pleasure of Dionysus, and Dionysus was one of Antony's own divine identifications, the god with whom the Roman general liked to compare himself. This was a performance of extraordinary sophistication, designed by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. Cleopatra was not coming to Tarsus as a suppliant. She was not coming as a client monarch answering a summons. She was coming as an equal, as a goddess meeting a god, as a queen whose cultural and spiritual authority was at least the match of Roman military power. The spectacle was a message, and the message was received. Antony invited her to dine with him. She invited him to dine with her instead. She entertained him with a banquet of such extravagance that Plutarch claims it astonished even those Romans who had witnessed the great feasts of the Alexandrian court before. She was demonstrating something specific, that Egypt's wealth was real, that her power was real, and that she had not come to Tarsus to beg for Roman favor, but to offer a partnership of mutual benefit. Antony returned to Alexandria with her, and there, in the winter of 41 to 40 BC, began one of the most celebrated relationships in the history of the ancient world. They called their inner circle the inimitable livers, a name that speaks of a particular philosophy, a particular embrace of pleasure and excess, and the vivid intensity of the moment. They feasted together and competed in hunting. They played practical jokes, uncommon citizens in disguise. They drank and argued and presumably talked, though we will never know what two such people, each at the height of their powers, said to each other in private. Antony left Alexandria in the spring of 40 BC to deal with a crisis on the eastern frontier, where the Parthians, the great Eastern Empire that Rome had never managed to conquer, had invaded Roman territory in Syria and Judea. He would not return to Egypt for more than 3 years. When he left, Cleopatra was pregnant. She gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, sun and moon. We do not know how she felt during those years of Antony's absence. The ancient sources give us no access to her inner life, only to her political actions. And her political actions during this period were those of a capable ruler managing her kingdom in difficult circumstances. She maintained Egypt's stability, continued her religious programs, conducted foreign policy with her neighbors, and raised her children. Antony, meanwhile, was dealing with Roman politics in ways that created extraordinary complications. In 40 BC, to seal a political alliance with Octavian, he married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman described by all ancient sources as genuinely admirable, patient, intelligent, and devoted. The marriage was a political calculation, not a love match, but it created a situation of considerable diplomatic delicacy. Antony was now married to a Roman noblewoman of the most respectable family, while the mother of his illegitimate twins waited in Alexandria. He returned to Cleopatra in 37 BC. The reunion was apparently joyful and political in equal measure. They conducted formal ceremonies of betrothal, not a marriage recognized under Roman law, but a statement of commitment that both parties clearly took seriously. Cleopatra was presented in the iconography of the Antony needed Egypt. His planned campaign against Parthia required logistical support on a massive scale, money, ships, grain, and military equipment, and Egypt was the only power in the eastern Mediterranean capable of providing it. Cleopatra needed Antony. Roman military backing was the ultimate guarantee of her throne, the only real protection against the inevitable day when Octavian, ambitious, calculating, patient Octavian, decided that Egypt was the last piece he needed to complete his control of the Roman world. The Parthian campaign of 36 BC was a disaster. Antony led an army of 100,000 men deep into Parthian territory, and was forced into a terrible retreat in which tens of thousands of soldiers died of cold and starvation and Parthian attacks. He lost a third of his army. He survived barely, and returned to the east humiliated and in need of comfort. Cleopatra met him with fresh troops and supplies. The gesture was strategic, but it was also something more. She had sailed to find him. In winter conditions, through difficult waters, at considerable personal risk. Whatever the precise nature of their relationship, this was not the behavior of a woman whose interest was purely transactional. In 34 BC, Antony staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, a ceremony of breathtaking political ambition that would prove to be a decisive turning point. Seated on golden thrones in the great gymnasium of Alexandria, before a crowd of thousands, Antony and Cleopatra presented their children to the world as the rulers of a new Eastern Empire. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt, with Caesarion named as her co-ruler and identified as the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar. Alexander Hilius was given the kingdoms of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, kingdoms that Antony had not actually conquered but intended to. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. The infant Ptolemy Philadelphus was given Syria and Cilicia. It was, in the language of modern political science, a declaration of intent, a vision of a new Eastern Empire ruled by a Greco-Egyptian dynasty with Roman military backing, positioned as an alternative center of power to Rome itself. And when news of the ceremony reached Rome, it was weaponized immediately and devastatingly by Octavian. Roman public opinion was already suspicious of Cleopatra. Roman propaganda had been painting her for years as an oriental seductress who had corrupted first Caesar and now Antony, a foreign queen who used her body as a political weapon and whose ambition was nothing less than the subjugation of Rome itself. The donations gave Octavian exactly what he needed, concrete evidence, or at least the appearance of it, that Antony had abandoned Roman values, Roman traditions, and Roman loyalty in favor of an Eastern monarchy that represented everything the Roman Republic had historically defined itself against. The war between Octavian and Antony was, in the first instance, a war of words. Octavian was a brilliantly effective propagandist. He understood that wars are fought in the imagination as much as on the battlefield, and he prosecuted the campaign against Antony with the same systematic efficiency he brought to everything else. He did not declare war on Antony, he declared war on Cleopatra. This was a stroke of political genius. Declaring war on Antony would have meant declaring war on a Roman citizen of enormous prestige, a legitimate magistrate, a man with powerful friends and a devoted army. It would have smelled like civil war, which was exactly what it was, but which Octavian could not afford to admit. By framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen who had seduced and corrupted a Roman, Octavian transformed it into a patriotic struggle against Eastern decadence and female ambition, a narrative that resonated deeply with Roman values and Roman anxieties. He read Antony's will publicly, a document he claimed to have seized from the Vestal Virgins, who kept such things in trust. Whether this was legally or ethically defensible was beside the point. The will, whether genuine or modified, included provisions for burying Antony in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome, and generous bequests to their children. This was presented as evidence of Antony's treachery, his abandonment of Roman identity, his corruption by a foreign queen. Antony and Cleopatra responded in kind, issuing their own proclamations and public statements. Antony formally divorced Octavia, which was both a political necessity and a public relations catastrophe. It removed the last fiction of his Roman respectability and handed Octavian's sister the status of wronged innocent. The Roman public, by and large, sided with Octavia. In the Senate and in the streets of Rome, the narrative Octavian was constructing was taking hold. Throughout this period, Cleopatra remained at Antony's side. She attended military councils. She commanded a portion of the fleet. When advisors urged Antony to send her back to Egypt, arguing that her presence was making Roman soldiers uncomfortable, that they would fight better without a foreign queen in the camp, the Battle of Actium, fought on the 2nd of September in the year 31 BC, off the promontory of Actium on the western coast of Greece, is one of those events that history has reduced to a single simplified narrative that does not do justice to its complexity. In the conventional telling, Antony and Cleopatra were on the verge of winning, or at least of fighting to a draw, when Cleopatra suddenly fled with her fleet. Antony abandoned his ships to follow her, and the battle was lost in a moment of inexplicable cowardice or passion. The reality, as modern scholarship has reconstructed it, is more complicated. By the time of Actium, the strategic situation had already turned decisively against Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian's general Agrippa had conducted a brilliant naval campaign in the preceding months, cutting off Antony's supply lines and seizing key Positions along the Greek coast. Antony's forces were weakened by disease, desertion, and supply shortages. His fleet was undermanned and many of his ships had been burned for lack of crews to sail them. The battle itself appears to have been, at least in part, a planned breakthrough, an attempt to sail the fleet through Octavian's lines and escape to the east, where they could regroup. Cleopatra's squadron did break through with the war chest, and Antony followed with a portion of the fleet. Whether this was the plan all along, or whether it became improvised when the situation deteriorated, is uncertain. What is certain is that the bulk of the fleet was left behind and surrendered, and the land army, which had been holding its position in the hills above the bay, found itself without naval support and with no realistic option except to negotiate its own surrender. It was a catastrophe, not because of a moment of romantic weakness, but because the strategic situation had made catastrophe almost inevitable. Octavian moved his forces toward Egypt. They returned to Alexandria knowing, at some level, that the end was near. Cleopatra began making preparations of a practical and a spiritual kind. She stockpiled treasure in her mausoleum, a great monument she had built near the temple of Isis, where she intended to be buried beside Antony, and where she kept the royal treasury as a form of leverage. She is said to have experimented with poisons, testing them on condemned prisoners to determine which produced the most painless and swift death. She sent Caesarion eastward with a large sum of money and a tutor, hoping to get him safely out of reach of what was coming. Antony, for his part, went through a period of profound despair and withdrawal before recovering something of his old energy. He won a minor military victory, pushing Octavian's advance forces back from the walls of Alexandria and allowing himself, briefly, to believe that something might yet be salvaged. He challenged Octavian to single combat. Octavian declined, with a response that the ancient sources record as politely contemptuous. Antony had many other ways to die. Octavian entered Egypt in the summer of 30 BC. Antony's forces melted away. Cavalry defected, infantry surrendered, and the end, when it came, was almost instantaneous. Antony received false news that Cleopatra was already dead. It is possible, though not certain, that she sent this news deliberately, hoping to provoke some action on his part. It is equally possible that the report reached him through confusion or betrayal, and in his grief he attempted to fall on his sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. He was carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her treasure and 2 attendants. He was hauled up through a window. She would not open the doors for fear that Octavian's soldiers would force their way in, and he died in her arms. He was 53 years old, she was 39, and she was now a prisoner, though one who still held the royal treasury and therefore a limited but real bargaining position. The final weeks of Cleopatra's life are among the most closely scrutinized in all of ancient history, and they remain, despite everything, deeply mysterious. Octavian needed her alive, at least temporarily. She was the key to the Egyptian treasury, and he also intended to display her in his triumph in Rome. The great procession of victory that was one of the highest honors the Republic could grant a victorious general. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She negotiated with Octavian through intermediaries, pleading for her children's lives, perhaps hoping to bargain the treasury for some kind of accommodation. Whether she genuinely hoped to survive, or whether she was simply buying time to arrange her own death in a manner of her choosing, is the central question that the ancient sources argue about and never resolve. Octavian visited her in person, the 2 most powerful people of their age, face to face at last. The ancient sources give us various accounts of this meeting, most of them colored by later political needs. In some versions, Cleopatra attempts to seduce Octavian. In others, she presents herself as a suffering suppliant. Octavian was 20 years younger than she was, and all accounts suggest he was not susceptible to the performance, whatever form it took. He was polite. He made reassuring noises about her safety, and he made sure that she could not escape. According to all ancient accounts, she died by the bite of an asp, an Egyptian cobra. The image has become one of the most potent symbols in all of Western culture. The Queen of Egypt, holding a snake to her breast, choosing death over the humiliation of Roman chains. The ancient sources vary in their details. Some say 2 asps. Others say the snake was smuggled in with a basket of figs. Others suggest that Octavian's soldiers found a small puncture mark on her arm when they discovered her body, but no snake in the room, and some modern scholars have proposed that she used a poison rather than a serpent. What all sources agree on is this: on the 12th of August in the year 30 BC, Cleopatra VII, last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Queen of Egypt, died in her mausoleum. She was 39 years old. Her attendants Iris and Charmian died with her. Iris, apparently already dead when the soldiers entered. Charmian still alive but dying, straightening the queen's diadem for the last time when a soldier demanded to know if this was right. "It is entirely right," Charmian is said to have answered, "and befitting the descendant of so many kings." Octavian, who would shortly rename himself Augustus and become the first emperor of Rome, gave her a proper burial beside Antony, as she had wished. He had Caesarion killed. He had the other children of Antony and Cleopatra brought to Rome, where they were raised by Octavia. Cleopatra Selene, the Moon, eventually became queen of Mauritania, in modern-day Morocco and Algeria, and named her son Ptolemy, the last descendant of that ancient dynasty to hold any royal power. The war over Cleopatra's meaning began almost before her body was cold. Octavian Augustus needed a particular version of her for his political purposes, a version in which she was dangerous, foreign, sexually transgressive, and ultimately defeated, serving as the dark foil against which Roman virtue could shine. The poets and historians of the Augustan age were compliant. Horace wrote an ode celebrating her defeat in terms that damned her with carefully modulated praise. Virgil's Aeneid included a description of the Battle of Actium, in which Cleopatra appears as a kind of monster figure. Her eastern gods ranged against Rome's Olympians. Propertius and Lucan added their voices to the chorus. The Roman image of Cleopatra was constructed systematically and with great skill, a femme fatale of superhuman seductive power, an enemy of Roman values, a cautionary tale about the dangers of passion and the corruption of great men by ambitious women. This image was so powerfully constructed and so consistently reinforced by the Roman literary tradition that it survived largely intact for 2,000 years. What was lost in this construction was almost everything that made her actually interesting. The Roman image was, at bottom, a sexual image. Cleopatra as the woman who used her body to control powerful men. The intellect, the languages, the administrative competence, the religious sophistication, the genuine political vision. All of this was either ignored or twisted into evidence of her manipulativeness. She became a symbol rather than a person, and symbols are much easier to manage than people. The irony is profound. A woman who was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world, a woman who kept her kingdom intact and prosperous for over 2 decades, who maintained Egyptian independence, in the face of overwhelming Roman power longer than anyone else could have managed, who was, by the evidence of her contemporaries, genuinely beloved by her own people, was remembered primarily as a seductress. The achievement was erased. The image remained. Cleopatra's posthumous life began immediately and has never ended. The image traveled. In the Middle Ages she appears in Chaucer's Legend of Good Women, recast as a Christian martyr of sorts, a faithful lover whose death demonstrated the nobility of her devotion. Dante placed her in the circle of the lustful in the Inferno. Condemned for subjecting reason to desire, the medieval church's version of the Roman critique, with Christian moral categories substituted for Roman political ones. The Renaissance rediscovered her through the Roman texts, and the combination of political drama and personal passion made her irresistible. Painters across Europe attempted her death. The asp at the breast became a subject of almost competitive intensity, with artists from Guido Reyna to Artemisia, Gentileschi to Giambattista Tiepolo, bringing their own interpretations to that final moment. Cleopatra of Renaissance art is almost always beautiful, almost always partially unclothed, almost always in the act of dying with an expression that combines pain and pleasure in ways that tell us more about the artist's fantasies than about the historical woman. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1606, is the supreme literary achievement in this tradition, a play of such extraordinary verbal and psychological complexity that it has shaped the way virtually every subsequent generation has understood these two historical figures. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is self-aware, theatrical, volatile, magnificent, and ultimately tragic. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale. Her infinite variety, Inobarbu says, in perhaps the most famous description ever written of any historical person. It is a tribute as much to Shakespeare's genius as to Cleopatra's reality, but it captures something real nonetheless, the sense that this was a person of extraordinary force and particularity, someone who could not be reduced to a simple moral or political lesson. The 19th century brought new obsessions. Cleopatra became a figure through whom European powers could negotiate their complex feelings about the civilizations they were colonizing, particularly Egypt, which became the subject of intense European fascination following Napoleon's expedition of 1798. Images of Cleopatra proliferated in opera and painting, in popular fiction, in the early spectacular productions of the theater. She was simultaneously the representative of an ancient civilization that Europeans admired enormously and a woman of the East, which meant, in the racial hierarchies of the period, something that required careful management. The 20th century gave her film, from the silent era through the Hollywood Golden Age to Elizabeth Taylor's legendary 1963 production. Cleopatra on screen became a cultural barometer, reflecting each era's anxieties about female power, racial identity, the relationship between East and West, and the uses of spectacle. The 1963 film, one of the most expensive ever made at that point, nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox while simultaneously making Taylor and Richard Burton's off-screen romance into a global spectacle that seemed to consciously echo the Antony-Cleopatra story. Art and life entangled themselves in ways that Cleopatra herself might have found amusing. In recent decades, a question that had always been present in discussions of Cleopatra has moved to the center of public debate. What did she look like? Specifically, what was her racial identity? The question has been made urgent by contemporary political and cultural concerns about representation, the whitewashing of ancient history, and whose stories get told by whom. The honest historical answer is that we do not know with certainty. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek in origin, and the family practiced intermarriage with extraordinary consistency. Their family tree is one of the most tangled in ancient history, with cousins marrying cousins and siblings occasionally marrying siblings across multiple generations. The identity of Cleopatra's mother is unknown. The mother of Ptolemy XII, her paternal grandmother, is also uncertain. Some ancient sources suggest she may have been a concubine of Egyptian or mixed ancestry rather than a royal princess. The coin portraits and sculptures that survive from Cleopatra's own time show a woman with a strong nose, a prominent chin, and a particular intensity of expression. Features that the ancient Alexandrian audience would have recognized and which were clearly regarded as appropriate for royal portraiture. They tell us little about skin color or racial background, since ancient portraiture was not primarily concerned with those categories in the way that modern audiences are. What we can say with confidence is that Cleopatra identified herself powerfully and consistently as Egyptian, as the earthly embodiment of Isis, as a pharaoh in the full tradition of Egyptian kingship. Whether this identification was genetic or cultural or both, it was the identity she chose to project, and it was the identity that mattered to the people she governed. Egypt was, in the ancient world as now, an African country, a civilization that grew from African soil and drew on African human diversity across its millennia of history. Cleopatra was its queen, in the fullest sense of that word. Archaeology has been slowly, painstakingly recovering a Cleopatra that the literary tradition obscured. The ancient harbor of Alexandria, largely submerged by seismic activity over the centuries, has yielded remarkable finds. The foundations of the royal palace complex, where Cleopatra lived and died. Statues of her presenting offerings to Egyptian gods. Fragments of the material world she inhabited. The Egyptian desert has given up papyri bearing her signature, a single Greek word, written in her own hand, meaning let it be so. The most direct physical contact we have with the woman herself. Temples throughout Egypt preserve her image, at Dendra, where a great relief shows her, as Isis standing beside Caesarion as Horus, the divine son. At Edfu and Philae, and a dozen other sacred sites, where she commissioned religious artwork and building programs that continued the great tradition of Egyptian royal piety. These images show us a Cleopatra that the Roman literary tradition entirely suppressed, a pious ruler, deeply embedded in the religious life of her kingdom, performing the rituals that maintained the cosmic order and demonstrated to her people that she was the legitimate heir of all the pharaohs who had come before her. The economic documents tell another story still, a competent, detail-oriented administrator who concerned herself with the practical mechanics of running a complex agrarian economy. Tax edicts, land grants, trade agreements, records of the grain distribution system that fed the population. These documents show a queen who understood that the glory of the court rested on the foundation of the Nile's annual gift, and who worked systematically to manage and maintain that foundation. The Cleopatra who emerges from the archaeological record is, in many ways, more impressive than the Cleopatra of legend, precisely because she is more human and more real. She was not supernatural in her beauty or her powers of seduction. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and education, operating with skill and courage in circumstances of almost impossible difficulty, holding together a kingdom that the most powerful military force in the world was determined to absorb, buying time for her country and her dynasty through every means available to her. Egypt became a Roman province. Its grain fed the Roman Empire. Its wealth funded Roman ambitions. Gods traveled to Rome in the baggage of the soldiers who had conquered it. Isis, above all, became one of the most popular deities in the Roman world, worshipped from Britain to Syria, a goddess who promised her followers what she had promised the Egyptians for 3,000 years: resurrection, healing, the undying love that overcomes even death. Cleopatra had made herself the goddess's earthly double, and the goddess outlived the queen by centuries. Caesarion was 17 years old when Octavian had him killed, shortly after his mother's death. He was the last Ptolemy, and the only child of Julius Caesar, who was also the child of a ruling monarch. What he might have become, in a different world, is one of history's unanswerable questions. Cleopatra Selene, the moon, lived to adulthood and ruled Mauritania with her husband Juba II, an intellectual king who wrote books about the natural world and filled his court with art and learning in the Alexandrian tradition. Her children and grandchildren carried Cleopatra's bloodline into the Roman world, where it eventually merged with the bloodlines of the emperors. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood for more than 1,000 years after Cleopatra's death, guiding ships into the harbor of the city she had governed, before it finally collapsed in a series of earthquakes. The library she had known as a girl, whatever remained of it in her time, faded gradually through the centuries, not in a single catastrophic burning, as legend would have it, but in the slow erosion that overtakes all institutions when the world that created them passes away. The city itself survived and changed. It became Christian, then Islamic, and is today one of the great cities of the Arab world, carrying its history in its bones, even when that history is not immediately visible. And Cleopatra herself? She became everything, a monster and a martyr, a seductress and a scholar, a woman of the East and a queen of the world, a lesson about the dangers of passion and an inspiration to everyone who has ever refused to accept the role that others assigned them. She was used and misused, celebrated and condemned, painted and filmed and written about in every century since her death, the most famous woman of the ancient world, and in many ways still the least understood. What she was at the core was a ruler, a queen who inherited a precarious throne and held it for 21 years through a combination of intelligence, political skill, religious authority, personal charisma, and an absolute refusal to give in to the forces that were trying to take everything from her. She lost in the end. Rome was simply too powerful, and the particular configuration of Roman politics in the 30s BC was particularly unfavorable to any independent power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But she lost only after fighting with every tool available to her, and she died as she had lived, on her own terms, in the manner of her choosing, with the diadem on her brow. The women who came after her, the queens and the scholars, the politicians and the warriors, the rulers of small and large kingdoms in every corner of the world, carry something of her in the very concept of what a woman in power can be. Not because she invented female authority. That tradition stretches back as far as human civilization reaches, but because she enacted it so completely, so publicly, and so unforgettably that the story could never be suppressed, even by those who most wanted to suppress it. Somewhere in the desert of the Nile Valley, or beneath the waters of the Alexandrian harbor, or in the ruins of a temple where her image still watches from the walls, her tomb waits. We have not found it. Perhaps we never will. The ancient city has swallowed so much, but the search continues. Archaeologists from a dozen countries working in the silt and the sand and the deep water, looking for the woman who was, for one extraordinary moment, the queen of the world. The Nile still floods each year, as it has for 10,000 years, bringing life to the delta, feeding the people of Egypt, moving in its ancient rhythms toward the sea. In the marshes where papyrus still grows, and in the clear winter air above the pyramids, and in the golden light that falls on the temples of Luxor and Karnak at sunset, something of the Egypt she loved and embodied persists. It does not need her tomb to be found. It does not need her physical remains to be identified and studied. It needs only to be seen in the right light at the right moment, and there she is, still, the last queen of Egypt, standing at the end of 3,000 years of civilization, her face turned toward a future she could not quite reach. This has been the story of Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator. Born in Alexandria 69 BC, died in Alexandria 30 BC, Queen of Egypt, Queen of Kings, Goddess incarnate, mother, lover, ruler, scholar, and last of her ancient line. She was 39 years old when she died, and she has never in any meaningful sense stopped living